The wheel of time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. Each week, we will be reading, discussing, and digesting a small selection from Robert Jordan's fantasy opus. This quest is led by Tylor, a true Wheel of Time warrior.
I have all stories, ages that were and that will be. And I'll be joined by Greg, a complete novice to the Wheel of Time.
The Wheel of Time and the wheel of a man's life turn alike without pity or mercy.
Join us each week as we read the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time, traveling deeper and deeper through the glass columns.
But what does that even mean?
No. You don't get to find out yet. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. I am Tylor, and I'm so excited to have you back listening to us talk about the Wheel of Time even more, even as, once again, my summaries are some people showed up and talked. Greg, what are your general takes on the early part of this book?
I mean, I'm not going to lie. I had a look at the page count at the end of these chapters, and I was like, we're 100 pages in, and this is the amount we've had happen. But I love it, right? It's time to sit in the world and time to be together. So I'm having a ball so far. Definitely not what I expected, but definitely in a good way. So, to that end, I think we should just dive right in. I'm ready to tackle these chapters. So we're going to start with chapter 3, The Peddler, and I'm going to throw it right to you, Tylor, to give us our summary.
Excellent. Well, The Peddler begins, unsurprisingly, with the peddler arriving to town. Padan Fain arrives. He's surrounded by a crowd of people. Everyone's trying to, get to talk to him and buy something. We meet Perrin Ibarra for the first time, kind of the third of our young male trio. So it's nice to kind of get to meet the blacksmith's apprentice. And then we get a little bit of a lore dump, right? Padan Fain starts telling us about the war going on in Galen, about the false dragon, about the Aes Sedai being sent south. We learn all of kind of the news of the world. And very quickly, it becomes apparent that the village council is a bit concerned about things kind of getting out of control, people starting to gossip. And so they gather Padan Fain inside. And this is when we then finally get to meet the characters we've been hearing so much about, Nynaeve the Wisdom, and then she's also accompanied by Egwene. And so we get a little bit of an interaction between them and the boys. And mostly, I think the big thing in this chapter is getting that big introduction out there. But crucially, big detail at the very end of the chapter, we learn that Perrin has also gotten a coin from Moraine, and so seems to have kind of been given the signal of being significant in the same way that the other boys have. And once again, I am summarizing a bunch of people talking. These summaries will get easier as things go on, I promise. But Greg, what were your impressions about this chapter?
I think again, it's certainly a slow pace, but it's not like Robert Jordan has worn out my patience yet. My joke about the 100 pages aside, I mean, this is only 70 pages in at the start. But it's okay to take that time, right? I think there's certainly, when I assign books to my students, I always get it's so slow, and no appreciation for what you gain when you take it slow, right? To look at what's there instead of what's not. So if we're looking at what's not there, it's plot, it's action, but we are getting a lot of really interesting world building. And, again, there was just these great moments. I think Padan Fain said, the great blight south to the sea of storms. And it was like we got this new circle outward from the small village. And maybe that's how I'm thinking about this. We started very tight on Rand and his father. We got to the next concentric circle, which was the village and everybody who's there. And now we're taking a step beyond the village, beyond this region even, and speculating at this time what's going on in the wider world.
Yeah, and I think you're exactly right to identify that Robert Jordan really is taking his time here and kind of slowly working us outward. And I think for me, you mentioned what's missing is plot and what's missing is kind of like pushing the story forward a little bit. For me, partially what's missing here is just a POV change, right? Like just as someone who reads a lot of, like relatively modern literature, I'm not used to being stuck in one character's head for 80 plus pages unless I'm reading, like dense literary work that is, 24 hours in someone's day or something. And so I think this is where I'm at with this book. Is I love it. I think it's great. I think it's setting the table, and I'm glad the table is being set as well as it is. But like, I'm just ready for someone else at this point in the book. And it'll be a little while, y'all. I'm sorry.
That's a really good point. And again, I think, my limited experience in fantasy means I pretty much always go to Tolkien or Game of Thrones, which I've read all the books of and watched the show, and I'm not sure I want to finish the books now. But
don't worry, you can't.
That's true. To your point, though, like those books, the particularly the Game of Thrones books, are broken up by point of view, and you get that rush of excitement when you see a new character's name at the top of a chapter, and then you get to read through them. And I always found myself kind of pausing at the end and flipping forward to see, when do I actually get back to Arya or whoever it was. So in that way, it is nice to kind of stay in Rand and see this kind of limited point of view. And for an introduction, that certainly means we're not going to get overwhelmed. I think experiencing the larger mythology, the larger world, as whispers from different characters to this central character works really well. And, it makes it manageable. I think, I alluded to all the long list of names and things like that. And really, knowing what I know in a limited fashion, that this is book 1 of 13, I'm like, I could see 13 books taking place around this small village as the war comes to it, or I could see us filling in the entirety of this map and seeing these names all filled in. We'd know what the Great Blight was, or the Eel Waste, or the Aerith Ocean, and things like that. And that's exciting. That's like, oh well, I want to fill in that map. And it reminds me a little bit of like Doctor Who or something, right? Where you experience one doctor and you're like, wait, there's been 50 years of this. I want to fill in more and go sample around and see what else there is. And it certainly establishes a world in which there could be a lot of stories, I imagine.
Yeah, and I think for me, as much as it is the world gets wide in this chapter and the next one, I think this chapter, you're right, the concentric circle kind of goes from like we're looking at a town to we're looking at a city. And then I think what really excites me about these 2 chapters, if we look ahead just a little bit, is that then what Thom Merrilin does, what the Gleeman does for us in the next chapter, is says, okay, not only do we have a big wide world, but it's also deep, right? He starts saying, let's not look around us. He says, let's start looking back. And we hear about all of these kind of other stories of the history of the world. So I like that metaphor of kind of the rings getting bigger, because then in the next chapter, we start looking at spheres instead of rings a little bit. And I think it does get a little denser.
Start playing 3-dimensional chess, you're telling me. I just wanted to get something black and white back into the mix.
Fair.
So help me with pronunciation. It's the war in Galdon?
Galdon, I believe, is the way they have pronounced that on the television show. I had always said Gildon, but I think it's Galdon.
Galdon. And so this is, at least according to Padan Fain, this is where the action is happening, right? Yes. And so, again, my Star Wars mind says, oh, if there's a bright center to the universe, we're on the planet that it's farthest from. So we're way out in a little village, and there is a lot of stuff going down in this bright center. And we're meant to think that a war in Galdon, if it's a real legitimate war, it's the circling back to the dragon and the dark one and yes, the whole light versus dark that broke the world. So a repeat of the breaking for it. Now, help refresh my memory about the Aes Sedai. What should I have remembered about them?
Yes. So at this point, Aes Sedai. What we know about them at this point in the book is basically we know that the dragon either was an Aes Sedai or in some way was associated with the Aes Sedai. We got that from Thom's story, or not Tom's story, I'm sorry, Tam's story, way back in Ravens.
Okay.
We also have a couple of times, I don't think we've really had this laid out really until this chapter to some degree, but we've heard a few places people respond oddly when there have been references to male Aes Sedai. So a couple of times, like when Tam told his story, I think one of the kids was like, well, that can't be right because the Aes Sedai were men. So something's going on with the gender there. And then in this chapter, we learn a couple of other things, right? So we learn, one, that the Aes Sedai are to some degree or another based in some place called Tar Valon, right? Padan Fain says that the Aes Sedai are coming south from Tar Valon towards Galedan. And the other thing that we learn in this chapter is that the Aes Sedai to some degree see themselves as if not protectors to some degree, at least they stand up to some sorts of evil in the world. We know that as soon as in Galedan there was a false dragon, that's when the Aes Sedai immediately became to get involved. But honestly, at this point in the book, this is a phrase we've seen thrown around by a lot of characters, but we don't have a lot of like concrete evidence of what they are or what they do.
Well, and all those references to ravens means that when you read this, you had no idea. You knew even less because so much of what you just said came from that added later prologue. So something that stood out to me that I really liked, I liked this notion of, we have a prophecy in the Dragon Reborn, but that's like, we know this, like we've heard this a million times, but the part I really liked was when they said, well, there've been so many false dragons, right? Yep. Like, and I think that's a really funny thing that like, if there is a well-known prophecy, why wouldn't every charlatan just give it a go? Yeah. And so they said there's been 3 in the last 5 years, and it means they're kind of laughing off this newest one as it must just be another of this. And that was a nice little wink and a nod, a funny thing to people familiar with fantasy, certainly. Yeah. But then what differentiates a real dragon is this idea of the one power, right? Yes. And as I wrote down, the ground opens, walls crumble, men who wield the power always go mad and waste away. Yes. And so certainly that resonates with the second prologue and the breaking of the world, which would always have been tied here. But also, again, it sounds like a little bit like the Force, but not, certainly not equivalent and not the same scale of what we're talking about here. But this idea of, the true dragon reborn, the dragon reborn would also go mad and waste away. Probably to be reborn again, right? And so the cyclical nature of all of this going on. So I thought that was all really interesting and fun. I told you I think it'll be out by the time we drop this episode, but I'm previewing a Star Wars book. I was given a galley of a Star Wars book, and I'm reading this book, and there's this thing called the power, and there's this thing called the ground quakes when they use it, and it wastes away whoever uses it. I'm like, I think this author just wholesale stole this from Wheel of Time, which I wasn't necessarily expecting. That is, I don't think I've given enough away to say like that is Star Wars Padawan, which is a young adult book coming out in July. So if people want to see if I'm crazy and they cribbed some notes from this, you're welcome to look at that. I just talked a lot though. Anything there you want to bump off of? Anything you want to respond to?
Yeah, I mean, I think you picked the right thing. I don't want to talk too much about the one power simply because I know what it is and how it works, and I don't want to be jumping in too much. But I think that detail you picked out is just spot on right? What's going on with men who use the power? How does that relate to the idea of a false dragon? And then I think also as you're kind of, talking about all of these people kind of like blowing this off, they're saying like, oh, it's just another false dragon. It's really nothing to be, super worried about. They even mention, I think, that of the like 3 false dragons in the last 5 years, I think only 1 or 2 of them could use the one power. It was unique that this person would. And so I think the fact that they're blowing that off in spite of all of that extra detail, I think you're exactly right to kind of pick up on that notion. I had a couple things from this chapter that I just quickly wanted to bounce to, if you don't mind, just like a couple quick hits. First off, I just need to mention, if you are someone who loves the television show of The Wheel of Time and hates the casting of the television show of The Wheel of Time. I'm very sorry. I have some bad news for you. In this chapter, we learn that Nynaeve and Egwene have dark hair, dark braids, brown eyes, and the same dark coloring as many other people in the area. I'm sorry, but this is a culture that holds braiding your hair as something important and sacred. These are people of color. Just get used to it. I'm sorry.
That sounds like what I've heard going on in many fandoms of late. And the fact that we kind of default to kind of Northern European beauty standards and just assume it's so. That's really interesting. I liked the hair braiding. I liked that was the indication that, oh shit, I don't know if we're cursing on this. Bleep me out with a cool Wheel of Time sound effect if you need to. But I like the idea that Egwene, that's the indicator that she's of marrying age too. It's like Rand's like, oh, right. Like I'm on the prowl, which means she's on the prowl too. So that's there as a part of that. And I think, I've just a note about the fact that the wisdom clearly has the power here, right? Like she, her reaction to the half stories that she was getting relayed through the boys, and then is like, well, I'll go take care of the village council. Like it was very clear to me that they're almost, the village council is allowed to like play their little games, but the women's circle is going to undercut and control whatever they want to do. And so I'm excited to see more of that dynamic, because that's an unexpected bit of politics in many ways. And I know we talked in the last episode about Robert Jordan playing a little bit with gender roles and stereotypes and so on. And then my last note for this chapter is just it says, have Tylor explain the Dark Friends.
I can't too much now.
Okay.
Other than just to say, like, when you key in on phrases like, if people are talking about dark friends, the nice thing about this world is that it is kind of a world with lots of black and white, right? And so while there are certainly shades of gray all over, in a lot of like fantasy settings, I feel like if someone talked about dark friends, I feel like you would default to like, is this an organization? Is it you know what I mean? In the Wheel of Time, if someone is called a dark friend, that probably means they are the friend of something dark, right? The way I would interpret like someone talking about someone or someone else being a dark friend is it is like the equivalent of calling someone like a Nazi, right? It's just like, you are super dark in this world, if that's the label that's being assigned to you. But
you're assigning our podcast a strong anti-Nazi stance, and I'm here for it. I think that'll be our first round of t-shirts when the time comes.
If there's one thing that I want to do, it's obviously drawing controversy, and so that's why I've decided to go anti-Nazi on episode 3.
Wow. Okay. Any other notes from you on this chapter?
No, I think that pretty much covers the main things that I wanted to talk about. I just want to hear one more. What was just like a random phrase that you jumped in on and were like, Padan Fain talked about this, I need to hear more?
Oh, I think I hit all the ones I wrote down. Oh no. I do have just under his speech, it just says, how big will this get? Which I guess that's what she said joke, but it was like, it kind of struck me at that moment, like, oh, I'm embarking on something huge. Like, when your friend asks you to read, 15 600-page books, it took until about page 90 where I was like, oh, this is actually going to be a big thing that I'm doing. My last note, just I enjoy it, says exposition and table setting but engaging, and I think that's where I'd leave it. It's like, yep, it hasn't lost me yet. It still has my emotion. So all right, I'm turning the literal page in my show notes to chapter 4, the Gleeman. Hit us with another one of your beautiful summaries about a person arriving and talking.
Yeah, I mean, the Gleeman is exactly what it sounds like. We enter Thom Merrilin, he of the white hair, spry, somehow both old and young in every description that we get. He begins by talking to what is now our foursome, so Rand, Mat, Perrin, and Egwene. Initially, he's kind of teasing them. He's kind of like poking fun at how knowledgeable they think they are about the world, when, as you say, we are about as far from the bright center of the universe as we possibly can get. Eventually, he kind of goes from just conversation mode into very kind of showman mode. We see Thom juggling kind of hinting, working up the crowd, getting people to pitch suggestions. He suggests a couple of stories that he's going to tell, which we are definitely going to spend some time talking about. And then he notices Moraine, gets very quiet. They have kind of a bit of a conversation. It's clear something's going on between the two of them. And then the village council emerges, and Tam tells Rand, we're going back to the farm. And they have a brief conversation. Most notably, Tam reveals that he believes Rand about the man in black, and that he's found that at least 3 other boys in the village have also noticed the rider in black. So that's what happens in the chapter. What was your big takeaway, Greg?
Again, here is where it really stood out to me that gender was mattering a lot, right?
That was Greg sneezing.
Wait, it didn't mute? I thought I muted the mic.
You did. I was just telling people what the silence was.
I was like, no, I have a fancy mute button for that. And now we can't edit it out. Welcome to live podcasting to tape. So gender and age mattered a lot here. So it's the young boys who have seen this threat. I don't know. My mind kind of turned on that for a moment, and how, oftentimes, especially in modern history, it's young men who have kind of limited prospects that are getting radicalized, for lack of a better term, everywhere from child soldiers to jihadists to, the right-wing social media trolls in America, right?
Not controversial at all.
No, not at all. But it's men like this who see a threat that may or may not be there and become radical to respond to it in whatever way, including but not limited to just like trolling celebrities online. So that stood out to me a lot. I think I liked this Thom Merrilin guy just for how kind of awful he was, right? Like the way he enters and is just like such attitude about treatment. It's this theme that the world is kind of fallen, or maybe again we're in podunk town, way away from who would treat a Gleeman well. But all of his kind of attitude there, and then really didn't seem to want to give the kids anything until he found like, well, if I give them a little, then they'll promote my show. So clearly out for himself. So yeah, I think those were my general impressions. What I want to throw to you on is this idea. So Rand has gray eyes.
Yes.
And you just said last chapter, you reminded us that this is a world of black and white, light and dark. And so this is the man who walks in the middle, or this is noted as odd. And I think it stood out to Thom Merrilin. So fill in whatever you can about that.
Yeah, I mean, to some degree, this comes down to the descriptions of Nynaeve, Egwene, and Perrin that we got in the previous chapter. And those descriptions of all 3 of those characters look very, very similar, right? They're described as having dark hair. They're described as having brown eyes. They're described as having relatively dark skin. I think the way it's written, historically, a lot of people have kind of interpreted the darker skin in the Two Rivers as like an olive complexion. I think you can read it as, a person of color, someone who had like, Hispanic or black complexion. But, I think Rand is not any of those things, right? The details we've gotten on him so far are taller than anyone in town, paler than anyone in town, red hair, gray eyes, right? And so Rand very much stands out, I think, in the environment of the Two Rivers. And the reason it keeps coming up is because there are so many other people who are now standing out in the Two Rivers in similar ways, right? So we see Thom also has light eyes. We see Rand mentions that Lan also has light eyes. We see a couple of mentions about relative heights of people and how Perrin and Rand really stand out in the Two Rivers as being tall. And that's especially true when you compare them to like Moraine, but when you compare to Lan, it's, oh my God, there's someone taller than these people in town. And so I think what we're getting here is just repeated little hints of like, something's a little different about Rand, something's a little different about Tam, little details here and there, but they're starting to add up. I think by the time that we're getting 4 chapters of world building and character development, they're going to add up to us starting to have some pretty big questions about a couple of these characters.
Excellent. So then the main quote I wrote down from this chapter is, I believe this is Thom talking. I have all stories, ages that were and will be.
Yes.
And what I liked about that phrasing and what I've learned about the Wheel of Time so far is that is literally true. That's
Yes.
not him saying I have stories from history and kind of fiction from the future, speculative fiction. That's him saying, no, I have a set of stories that were true and will be true again.
Yeah.
And so I really liked that as a trick and as a play on these themes. But maybe, I mean, obviously talk about whatever you want, but I'd love to let you use that as an opening to unpack a little bit of his stories and what he shared.
Yeah, I identified 4 stories that very clearly play into what you're describing, right? The idea of the past is future, right? So the first one that jumped out to me is he says that he is going to tell the story of Len, who flew to the moon in the belly of an eagle of fire. Any idea who we're talking about here?
I mean, it just sounds like my average Saturday night, right? Hey, babe, you want to go fly to the moon in the belly of so we're going back to one of the prequels, or the prologues, I would imagine.
We are going back to the 1960s. I think this is John Glenn and the Eagle Has Landed.
Oh, I see what you're saying here. Hit me with it again, the name of it.
So he tells the story of Len, who flew to the moon in the belly of an eagle of fire.
Okay.
He tells the story of Mosk the giant, whose lance of fire could reach across the world, and his war with Elsbeth, queen of all. I believe Mosk is Moscow. The lance that can reach across the world is nuclear weapons. And Queen Elizabeth is being mistaken for the leader of America.
Okay.
Our third.
This is like I feel like I'm hearing somebody being like Nostradamus knew it all, like he had it in his notebook. See, this secretly means 9/11. But go ahead.
It's actually the 4th in the chapter, but it's the 3rd that I could decode. I think this is the clean one. I think this is the one that will make it clear to you that this is what he is doing. Because he says that he is going to tell the tales of Ma Therese the healer, mother of wondrous Ind. If that is not Mother Teresa of India, I don't know what he's referring to.
So he changed it enough that all of this went over my head, or maybe a toddler was screaming at me at that moment and I missed it. But so the implication you're saying is that this is not Middle Earth. This is not, Westeros. This is our world, and we are a part of this story, and the things we know and the history we know are a part of this world, which I was not expecting. I think if we go back to my terribly wrong predictions, I just assumed this was a pure fantasy world at all. Okay. And so if that is true, then this would then by its nature be both before our time and after our time.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Okay. I'm going to wrap my head around that a little bit more.
Okay.
The note on the stories I wrote, and this is real Greg deep thought here, lots of Arturs, right? They mentioned like a lot of Arturs.
And it's worth noting that's likely intentional, right? In the same way that we hear the story of Len flying to the moon or Ma Therese healing people in Ind, odds are pretty good that the story of Arthur we're hearing about is either the same story that eventually evolved into the King Arthur legend, or is some other turn of the wheel where Arthur in one life was the Arthur we're reading about, Arthur Pendrag Tenreal, and in another life was Arthur of the Round Table.
That was what I was just going to look at, because I knew once that there was a kind of bastardization of Pendragon there. So that was the one I was just grabbing my book, if you saw in the video, to think through. All right. So now I really understand when you're saying we're working with spheres here. We're going into this in a totally new and different way.
I actually need you to tell me if you can decode the 4th story, because I have no idea what this is.
All right.
So he leads off with Len, who flew to the moon in the belly of an eagle of fire. And then he says, and his sister, Salya, that's Salya, walking among the stars.
Salia walking among the stars. Well,
Sally Ride?
Yeah, because one of the things that I just realized when you were repeating the part about Len is John Glenn didn't go to the moon.
He didn't. Right. These
Right?
stories are all
He
bastardized.
orbited. So yeah, so again, it's through the ages. So the name was Salyri?
Salya, Salya.
I mean, certainly Sally Ride makes sense to me, who walked among the stars.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting that this then would suggest, and I don't know what I'm implying about our world, but that the 20th century was like the peak of the world and like worthy of legends. I mean, talk to my boomer family members and they'd probably be like, yep, they got it right. But I do think that that's an interesting thought to say, like, oh, this is like, our heroes, for lack of a better term, from our society are like as great as the society ever got, and we're legendary to this far fallen kingdom.
Now, I will note, I think you're absolutely right. What we live in now would absolutely have been the legends of this kingdom. It's worth noting, in the world of the Wheel of Time, there is a thing called the Age of Legends, and I'm pretty sure it's not our world. Just simply because Lews Therin lived there, right? We've seen one scene from what is now called the Age of Legends, and it clearly does not, like, no one is creating volcanoes out of the one power in our time frame that I am aware of.
Let's
look Elon Musk, probably.
But... yeah. Which billionaire has slipped into becoming a Bond villain of late? Okay. Yeah. So actually, I think this is the first time in this podcast where I'm thinking I need to go back and reread that a little more closely and think through some of that. I think it was easy for me to just be like, he's just mentioning a lot of fake stuff and continuing on.
And most of it is, right? There are probably 20 titles in there and 4 of them fit. But I just think it's a cool detail that's worth digging into.
Absolutely. So other notes on this chapter, there's clearly some strife between the council and the circle, as we alluded to last time, but it seemed more focused on Moiraine here, right? So the women's circle really dislikes Moiraine. Is that the right read on that?
Or at least Nynaeve does. I'm never quite sure in this chapter, because Rand isn't critically evaluating how much of it is the women's circle and how much of it is Nynaeve. I don't quite know how to, right? Yeah. Robert Jordan does a very good job of third person limited, which means I don't have that information. But yeah, no, I think that's exactly the read, is that it seems like the village council is really concerned about the war, and Nynaeve and possibly the women's circle are much more concerned about all of these strangers being in town, most notably Moiraine and Lan. And yeah, that clearly seems to be the source of some conflict.
Sure. The kids are going to join the patrol. And the goal of the patrol is basically to figure out how much of this is accurate, but also to kind of flush out whatever is in the bushes around the village and might threaten the festival. But then just a particular moment where they rethink the Dark Rider a bit and say, what if he's not some kind of supernatural threat or the Dark One, but is instead a refugee from the war, potentially a thief? And all of that kind of made me think, well, it had the feel of like a red herring. It's like, no, let's keep our eye on the ball. This guy is really a villain. But also, perfectly, it tends to be that if they tell you the answer, then that's not the answer. Right. So I suspect it's not just as simple as a refugee. It might be somebody fleeing from the conflict or spilling into that. But I also just kind of took that all as a big hint that the kind of seclusion of this village is over, and we're going to be drawn into these larger world events pretty quickly.
Yeah, and I actually, kind of tying into that, I really liked the section, I think it was just before what you're describing, where Thom is talking to the boys in Egwene, and we get a feel for why the Two Rivers is kind of so isolated, right? They talk about, like, there's mountains to the west, and there's like a swamp to the east, and then to the south, there's rapids, and then 100 miles of kind of like unincorporated forest, and then the north is pretty much the only way into the area. And so I think it's it's both interesting to think of just how isolated they are, and yet they're still worrying about this war that feels like it's a half a world away. But then I think it's also a good reminder, this is a decent chance to pop out that, you know, map that's at the beginning of the book and realize geographically, Galedan and the Two Rivers are actually relatively close to one another. There are just some intervening, pieces of geography that make travel over that area distant. But it's not as if we're looking at something that's literally on the other side of the world, right? Galedan is basically a neighbor to the Two Rivers if it weren't for the many, many barriers that stop people from crossing from one to the other.
Well, and you're reminding me too that the boys bragged about basically having covered it all, right? That they've been deeper into the swamp than anybody else has. They've been further into the forest or know the forest better, which is part of why they're ready for the patrol and to be a part of this larger process. So, and then I'm gonna just confess, I don't know. My last note for this chapter is just the word unity. Which I think the character spoke a lot of unity, that was the goal. Like, let's unite, let's make a plan. And I think in a book that is so defined by dichotomy, that unity then becomes a really interesting theme to kind of end on, right? Because, again, the primary conflict here seems to be light and dark. But what if it is instead, unity against division, and what will that lead to? So yeah, I liked this chapter, but I did kind of close that out saying like, all right, I'm ready to get going. I'm ready for this plot to start taking over a bit more, so that we can move forward.
Fair enough. I mean, I have one more thing that I wanted to chat about with regard to this episode, if you don't mind. Although I will just say, as we're talking about kind of like the chapter kind of closing on unity, I do think it's very interesting and very telling of, to some degree, how this storytelling happens, that we get the boys gather together and they're like, we are a united front, we are going to get things done. And then 2 pages later, it turns out that the village council has been doing exactly the same thing. So the simultaneous, we are going to be united and solve this problem together, while having 2 groups saying that independently is both effective and kind of ironic. The other thing that I wanted to mention is a moment towards the end of this chapter where Thom notices Moraine is in the crowd for the first time, and his immediate reaction is to stop performing and then to have a conversation with Moraine, more or less. And so I wanted to start just getting whether you kind of keyed in on that, whether that was a dynamic that you had thought about. And then I also want to just talk briefly about the conversation they had.
I remember noting particularly that, on paper, sure, as a phrase, they seem like they should be friends, right? Like Moraine was interested in stories. Here's the storyteller. And I think one of the boys essentially says that, like, like you guys should get to know each other. Like you like stories. But I definitely noted that there was formality there that hadn't been in the rest of the chapter. And I think at moments I thought this seems like it's going to be confrontational, and then he was more deferential, which, considering he started the chapter talking about his treatment, then it's like, okay, so this is somebody who he respects, which maybe because she is of a class that wields power elsewhere, or may just be that, it's an angle for him, right? Like, oh, I've always wanted a patron. I was just reading a book about patronage and in early modern Europe, the things you read when you're a boring academic. And so that struck me as like, oh, he's looking for a patron. He's looking for somebody to help him. And, if she wants stories, he wants to perform stories. And, there could be a mutually beneficial relationship there.
Totally. First off, when Thom sees Moraine immediately, he freezes, right? And then I think the read you have is exactly right? There's something about class going on here. There's something about the social structure. But then I think once we identify that, like, maybe they're both of upper class, maybe they're both from like outside, and so they like know something about each other, or they, like you say, maybe they just have similar interests. But as soon as that gets identified, they start talking over the heads of everyone in the village. And the conversation basically goes like this. It's Moraine says, no, I don't take any disrespect from what you said. You seem like a nice enough person. And then she basically says, she calls him Master Bard. She tells him to call me simply Moraine, and then says, I'm a stranger just like yourself. Thom's response is to say, I trust you'll like my stories as much as everyone else does. And Moraine says, and first Rand reads that Thom is not pleased at this point. And then Moraine's response is, I like some stories, I don't like others. I trust you'll tell the right stories. And Thom's like, yep, definitely. And then the thing fades out, right? But this is very clearly like a 2 or 3 set of dialogue for each character back and forth, where they are having a conversation about how he's going to refer to her, or what stories he's going to tell, or what stories he's not going to tell, or they're clearly saying something to each other that both the reader and the town are not completely picking up on at this point.
Interesting. And I'm going to confess to having a Star Wars prequel thought, which is it reminds me a little bit of Jango Fett and Obi-Wan Kenobi talking to each other in the apartment, where they both understand that they are talking about how, hey, dude, you just tried to assassinate the senator.
Yep.
And yet they keep it on a civil level, that kind of undertone and that kind of hinting. I mean, my mind naturally goes to the darkness and the light, and she is on one of those sides and doesn't want the other even represented. Themes of propaganda or of slanted representation kind of come through there, right? That they're like, well, there's one history to tell, or there's one set of stories to tell, so that you can reinforce the side you're on. Yeah. So I think a lot of that went over my head, or is escaping my memory now, but certainly feels like, as we build towards, I assume, this festival, that there's going to be a lot of kind of, let's pan around the crowd and see how everybody is reacting to everybody else, and see if we can kind of sort out our sides fully among these people and fit that into the larger world.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely the direction that this is heading. And so I think for me, I just always like to pick up, what are these like weird, like you're saying, we're going to get the full picture of what's going on. And so for me, I'm always curious, how is Robert Jordan telling us some of these little things 15 chapters before they actually come up? So I apologize if sometimes I do the podcast version of vague booking, where I'm like, let's talk about a thing, but I'm not going to say anything about it.
Sounds good.
Any last thoughts on this chapter?
I mean, again, hopefully when people are listening to this, it's like, oh, they've been doing great. They have weekly releases, but 100 pages in, it's a little in doubt when you start a project like this. And, so we are also kind of figuring out our rhythm and plan as we are practicing in these episodes. So I think we're settling on, we're going to try to do about 2 chapters, or roughly 30 pages each episode. We had waited to fully announce that until we were sure about how long our episodes were. And that should help us keep it to under an hour most weeks, unless there's something really big going on. So we hope that's a pace people can keep up with. We already have talked to some people who are grabbing the audiobook to follow along with, and that's a great way if you don't have the time to read. But we, of course, want to hear from all of you about what we're doing right, what we're doing wrong, and how we can improve this, because we want this to be a community. And, it might be a little delayed to hear us respond to the feedback we receive, but I promise you we'll be listening to it. We're academics, so we're used to getting our evaluations at the end of the semester and then course correcting. So like 5 or 6 episodes in, you'll hear a real uptick in quality. So that's it.
I make no promises about upticks in quality. I just want to be clear about that. And yeah, I think you're exactly right about the pace, Greg. And if that's the case, then next week, I believe we are going to be reading Chapter 5, Winter Night, and Chapter 6, The Westwood. And let me just say, while I can't guarantee groundbreaking, world-changing plot, I can tell you in chapters 5 and 6, there will actually be plot. So get super pumped. It is time to finally get into what is potentially happening on Winter Night at the festival and see where things finally go in this world, rather than just seeing the world. So hopefully we'll see you in the next episode. You'll get a chance to hear us talk about this. And like Greg said, please let us know what's going well, what's going poorly. And we look forward to seeing you next time through the glass columns.
So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, or Amazon. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, you can email us at throughtheglasscolumns@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Twitter by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to the show, leave us a review wherever you're listening, and recommend the show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time through the Glass Columns.